I'm John Forde. Coming up next, I'll be speaking with Minnesota Secretary of State Mark Ritchie. That's next on the St. Paul Forum. Welcome to the St. Paul Forum. I'm John Forde. With me today is Secretary of State Mark Ritchie. Welcome, Mr. Secretary.
Great to be back on your show. Thanks for inviting me.
We are delighted to have you here. You've had such a storied career, but as often happens, I learned an interesting thing about you 20 seconds before we roll tape. I thought you were from Iowa. You are from Iowa, but you were born in?
Georgia. That's right. My mother's family and part of my father's family were there. They met right after the Second World War, and it's a state where I lived every summer till I was 10 or 11 and spent a lot of my time and go back often with the cousins and the marriages and funerals and that kind of thing. But it also, it gave me a different way to think about some parts of our country's history, for example, and I've had the privilege of co-chairing with Representative Dean Erdahl from Litchfield, State Representative, our Minnesota Sesquicentennial Civil War Commemorative Task Force. So we've been talking about Minnesota's role in the Civil War, and of course, all of us who have a love of history, it's a way to bring different perspectives together and then learn what we can from the past and see how it might guide us in the future. So I felt very fortunate to have lived in a lot of different parts of the country, but my wife and I moved here 30-some years ago and feel very blessed to be in Minnesota.
Is it extra sticky? What about the culture here attracted you?
Well, for the first time, my wife was from New York, I was from Georgia and Iowa, we were living in San Francisco and adopted a new baby, and we said, okay, we want to live nearer family. Mm-hmm. And for me, being back in the Midwest also was being in a culture that had a very strong affirmation of civic engagement. Nonprofit and community-based organizations. Of course, we know Minnesota is by far the highest voting state in the nation, but we're also number one in volunteerism and charitable contribution. There's just a culture of giving back to the community here in the upper Midwest, but especially in Minnesota, that was very, very attractive. And I brought my wife here on a very beautiful July day with white puffy clouds and blue sky, and we moved here and have been very, very glad that we made that move and feel very settled in. But I, of course, appreciate all parts of our country, just like every corner of the state has a different kind of attraction, a different kind of gift. And so Minnesota's a great home base, but I also like keeping up with what's going on in other parts of our nation.
Now, before you got into politics, you started the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, as well as the League of Rural Voters. That's very ambitious.
Well, I was working in the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, and actually my father had worked in the U.S. Department of Agriculture as a scientist. And I had trained in science and was also working on policy. And in that work here in the state, I became more and more aware of how the international policy making had begun to, in a sense, trump national policy making, much like national policy making in Washington, D.C., had begun sometimes to trump decisions being made here in Minnesota and St. Paul, and sometimes St. Paul trumps down on the county. There's a kind of hierarchy, and I began studying very carefully how those international policy making institutions, the trade agreements and some of the others, how they really affected family farms and rural communities right here in my home state here in Minnesota. And so after a years of service in the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, with some others, we created a nonprofit organization working on policy. And after a few years, we began to think, well, we need to pay attention to the people who are making the policies. And so the League of Rural Voters was born, kind of like League of Women Voters, to educate the public and to raise issues that lift up into the broader community the concerns of small town, rural communities, family farmers, those who really make up the the backbone of our state's economy and of our state's wider community. And that was a very good preparation for thinking about the role of the Office of Secretary of State as one of the keepers of our democracy, because it's the democracy that chooses the policymakers, and then the policymakers who then ultimately set the policies that help define the future. So there was a kind of logic for me personally, but it is a separate world, this elected office world.
And how much is the League of Rural Voters? I mean, I recognize that you have another job now, but how much are they involved in educating the public as to how much agriculture really is the backbone of Minnesota's economy?
Well, I'm a dozen years since that time, but League of Rural Voters is very active, especially in rural communities like Northfield and various places, helping people to see that it takes a strong raw material economy, farm economy, forestry, that kind of thing, to help put a kind of a base underneath the rest of the economy. And I think in general, as I look across the country, this period of a lot of speculation and fraud and Ponzi schemes and banks sort of, being in the middle of a larger economic system that seemed out of control, there's been a desire to, I guess, think more grounded, pardon the pun, in a more concrete way about where does real wealth come from. And so people in rural communities are often more directly tied to forestry or forest products industry, to mining and things going on in our mining industry, farming, or other kinds of natural resource. And in the case of Minnesota, of course, we also see that our environment is really important to just our spiritual well-being and our recreational and our sort of sense of who we are as a people. So League of Rural Voters and I think other organizations pay a lot of attention to making sure that the larger community is thinking about the concerns of all of our citizens. It's easy when you're in the big city to forget maybe about some of the other parts of the state, and that's one of the things they do. And frankly, for me as Secretary of State, to have the privilege of traveling in all 87 counties and working with the county officials or the local township officials, there's an element to my job as a statewide elected official that has been such a gift of getting to know other parts and many parts of the state. And somebody told me when I was elected that it would be something that I had not anticipated, but I would someday say was one of the most important parts of my job, and they were absolutely correct. I've found that the privilege of getting to know people in every corner of the state and all kinds of circumstances has been the thing that has most enriched my life as part of this great job of serving Minnesotans as their Secretary of State.
You had this long career, 20 years with the Institute for
Agriculture and Trade Policy, that's right.
And then you made the decision to run for statewide office. That took a lot of nerve.
Well, there was a period when I had taken a leave from running the Policy Institute to work on nonpartisan voter registration. My friend from my policy work on agriculture, Paul Wellstone, had run for office, had been elected U.S. Senator, and when Paul and Sheila and others were killed in that plane crash, it was sort of a challenge, saying, now wait a minute, Paul set a standard for public service, and he created the possibility that elected public office should be on every person's consideration. If you want to find ways to give back to the community or be in public service, lots of ways to do that. Armed forces is the most important and the most fundamental, lots of other things. But in the period of time after the crash and the death, and the period of time where I began thinking more carefully about what it would take to run for office, it was also a time where I reflected on what should be my sort of structure or the way that I serve the public. And so it turned out that for me, because I had such a focus on policy and was paying more attention to the policy makers, Senator Wellstone was on the Energy Committee and on agriculture and the things that mattered. It was almost a natural thing to say, and how are we doing in the care and feeding and protection and in the encouragement and nourishment of our democracy itself. We had some shocks in our country back in 2000 in Florida, and had a kind of a terrible situation where the election just kind of melted down and fell apart. There were some other things around the country that set off alarms, and so for me, putting part of my attention onto taking care of, being a good steward of our democracy was one way to make sure that there was a broad participation in the choice of our policymakers, and that allowed for high quality policymaking to really help shape the future of food and agriculture in rural Minnesota. So I got in my car and drove for 2 years almost, 18 months, county by county by county, and talked to every person I could. And I enjoyed that, and it fit who I was, and it turned out to be a very successful from an electoral point of view.
I'm trained as a psychologist, so I know a lot of metrics. And the average person knows about 300 people, but the average politician knows better than 3,000. You must have a tremendous aptitude for names and faces. And did you know that from the time you were small?
I know that when I was younger, I could remember names better than now.
Oh,
so
really?
I know this,
Okay.
that over time, but for example, I'm at the fair as long as I can be every day during the time of the fair, because one of the most important things in elected office is door knocking, going door to door and really talking to people face to face. When you run statewide, you can't do that, but I always say to people, but you can come knock on my door at the state fair. So people all day long, and sometimes they have a complaint, and sometimes they have praise, and sometimes they have something that's a great idea, and sometimes they have a wild idea, and sometimes they're talking to me and thinking that I'm in a different role. So it's all over the map. But in that way, you do get to know people, and you get to know their story. And once you know their story, then they're different than a name or a face. They're somebody whose daughter, we have a program in our office that we created called Vote in Honor of a Veteran, and it's just a badge, and it's got a line, and you can put in the name of a veteran as a way to say thank you for your service, and I'm going to vote this year because that's part of my service. I always put my dad, who was a Marine in the Second World War, and a woman came by and stopped and looked at that, and she picked it up. She said, "My daughter's in Kuwait right now," and she wrote her daughter's name down, and then she told me her story of her daughter and missing her daughter and staying in touch with her daughter. And so every year now she comes by and she picks up another button, and your daughter's home and all of that, and now there's grandchildren and all of that. So there's an element of learning the story that then changes it from, let's say, a name in a database or something like that. It starts to be, and that's part of who we are as a community of people here in Minnesota.
In case you're just joining us, this is the St. Paul Forum. I'm John Forde. And today we are delighted to be interviewing Minnesota Secretary of State Mark Ritchie. So in preparing for this, I totally messed up. I don't know if it's half your job, but I think of this as all politics, but you are also responsible for corporate registrations, domain registrations. How much of that takes up your time?
Well, it's 2/3 of our office, 2/3 of our staff, 2/3 of our budget, and it's really one of the places that we intersect with Minnesotans at a very high level, because every person who's creating a new business, more or less every person, it's about 60-some thousand a year, come through our door to start a new business, and then they have ongoing services that they use with our office, and so it puts us in touch with a lot of people. This last year we put a lot of effort into helping link veteran-owned businesses with some of the big projects and some of the things that are going on, because there's some preferences for our veterans and returning soldiers. But that office does also some special things. There's something that is not very well known in society. It's called an apostille. It's kind of like a super notary, and you use it a little bit in overseas business, use it a little bit in some things that have to do with students traveling overseas, but its main use is for international adoptions. And we have young couples rushing into our office kind of looking wild-eyed with a backpack, and we know who they are. They got a call from Russia or Guatemala and says, if you get your paperwork and you're on a plane at 10 and you go blah, 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 then here you will have the opportunity to bring home a baby or a toddler and to start your family, and they're rushing to get paperwork from us, and they have to get an apostille, and they're running around, and everybody comes out, and everybody helps them, and they push them out into a cab or a waiting car, and 6 months later or something, they'll come in kind of blurry-eyed, you know, parents are kind of new, and maybe a baby or a toddler, and they'll come in to show. And so our office has a way of connecting with the real lives of people in ways that I think are, you know, not necessarily known or maybe seem kind of unusual in the public, but they are reminders for all of us who are there providing those services day in and day out, to the tiniest of new businesses, to a family trying to adopt, to a giant corporation who's filing liens all day long as part of what they do for a living. We're able to connect because those services we provide are crucial for how our society functions. In fact, one of my main tasks of being the keeper of and taking use of the state official seal, you know, we put official seals on documents to provide a kind of assurance. There are seals that have been found in archaeological digs that are about 5,000 years old. So one of the tasks that I have in that business services is something that societies have been doing for thousands of years. Somebody is asked to say out loud with a seal or some symbol, I'm certifying that this document is exactly what it is intended, and these signatures are the authentic. It's why I'm the last person to sign legislation. There's all these different legislators, and then there's the governor's signature, but the last signature is mine. And that signature, when I put it on it, it represents what it has for thousands of years. I'm saying this document is exactly what the legislature in this case intended, and these signatures are the authentic signatures of these people. And so that function, that sort of authentication that we do in our office, it has a personal connection that we can appreciate every once in a while with the human lives that are involved, and we also know it comes through human history. It has a very long beginning, and so we're part of a long-term process. And both of those things, I think, give us a kind of awareness that what might seem to somebody as a kind of clerical administrative task, yes, it's clerical, it's administrative, but it's also part of a core of society's functions, and I think we feel good about that.
There's tremendous gravity to officiating that,
Yes.
to documenting that final step in legislation. But there's also the incredible sanctity of the burden of being the election official, the chief election official in Minnesota. And according to Wikipedia, you presided over the most publicly scrutinized recount in the history of the United States Senate. And according to most reports, you came through with flying colors.
Well, and I think it's fair to say that up until perhaps that recount, we didn't quite have the level of digital technology and others. Everybody on the planet could watch every step of that recount over the internet. And so we had a kind of special circumstance. But Minnesota's system is set up, it's taken 150 years to build our election system, but the laws and the rules and the expectations are so good that they mandate a very open, very transparent process. We have a special panel with Supreme Court justices and judges and all of those things. And the modern technology allows people, even if they don't live in the Twin Cities or they can't get to the courthouse or whatever, we now have the ability to be transparent from a digital perspective to the broad society, but it's our laws and our customs that are really aimed at sort of being open and transparent. That means that it was able to be not just scrutinized, but for people to actually feel like they had been part of the process. And I believe all of the very positive comments, not just from Minnesotans, but my fellow election officials, secretaries of state from around the country, they watched this and they said, you know, you guys did it so good in Minnesota. It helped heal some of the wounding, some of the damage that had occurred because the Florida situation in 2000 had really left a bad image of elections, of election officials, of the process. Minnesota left such a positive image that it helped to heal some of that. And it made me really proud to be a Minnesotan, of course, but also that our system was able to be put to the test and to come through that test in a way that increased people's trust and their belief in caring for our system. And for me, as an election administrator, my top priority is that being a good steward of a great system. And I feel like I've been able to accomplish that in my relatively short time in that office, and I feel great about that.
There's so much more I want to get to. We only have about 6 or 7 minutes left, but in addition to being Secretary of State of Minnesota, you are president of the National Association of...
Was president, so we've now
ended.
rotated,
Okay.
yes.
Okay. What was that like for you?
Well, it was fun.
It tells me they want to copy you.
Well, one part of it was, of course, people had watched what we did in Minnesota, and they were very appreciative. And it's not just the recount. We're by far the highest voting state as a percent of our eligible voters of any state. They want to know why. They say it's partly because we have election day registration. We have a very engaged community of people. We're civically minded. But it was also interesting because secretaries of state, although it's a little different in each state, not all have elections, not all are elected themselves, some are appointed, not everyone has business services, but generally speaking, they serve a kind of a common function around the country. And so as a national association, we strive very hard to sort of keep the partisan politics out of that and try to think about who are we as the stewards of this system, and how do we help each other do a better job. So Minnesota, we've been able to watch how other states do certain things, and the things we can learn from them, and they want to come and learn from us. So it was a privilege to be chosen as the president of that national association. I was then able also to host the national gathering of our secretaries, and it's always fun to show off and brag about Minnesota, but when you can bring people here, it's great. But I also feel like it gave me a kind of an appreciation. When you learn things from other states, then you can bring that at home, but also the more you know about other states, it's just a little reminder just how terrific our system is here in our state as well. So I always like that opportunity to be reminded what a great place it is to be Secretary of State.
Now, I would be remiss if I didn't bring up the ballot initiative last time around about voter ID. And in fact, in show prep, we talked a little bit about the electronic roster task force, which you thought wouldn't be the most scintillating topic, but I'm fascinated by it. Is that essentially a counterbalance to needing to carry ID? Is that the state says, we know who you are the second you walk in the precinct?
No. It's electronic poll books or electronic rosters are being used in lots of states. For example, North Dakota's probably got the best use of electronic rosters of any state around us. Terrific. But they don't have voter registration. They don't fool around with any of this stuff.
How do you not have registration?
Well, we never had registration until the early 70s. The legislators wanted registration so that they could have a list of voters so they didn't waste a nickel on a stamp or doorknob. And the governor didn't want voter registration. They didn't have it in North Dakota. We didn't have it here. Actually, we had voter registration where there were students and soldiers. So we had a certain kind of discriminatory voter registration system. And so the governor and the legislature compromised because the legislature wanted a list of voters so they knew which doors to knock on. They didn't waste time, which drives me crazy. And so the governor said, okay, but we're going to have same-day registration, which they'd had in Wyoming, and Connecticut had had it 100 years earlier. But so voter registration is kind of a modern invention. Its purpose in the original form in Texas was to discriminate. It was a part of their racial discrimination. In the case of Minnesota, it was for politicians who didn't want to waste time knocking on the doors of people who weren't on the registration list, which is kind of a discrimination against new people or young people, whatever. But anyhow, North Dakota has the best close-by use of these electronic poll books, and so we've been trying to learn from their experience. And what's nice is some of our election officials in Minnesota on the border live and vote in North Dakota, so they have the actual experience, and they can bring that experience in. Electronic poll books are, a little bit expensive, and so they're often first adopted in some cities and communities who have a little bit more budget, and that helps all of us because it gives some actual experience. But I have to tell you that particularly the townships, and about half of our polling places are townships, they've had about enough of mandated equipment, and they're very leery about more mandates, more cost, more equipment. If you don't have electricity in your township, or if you have snowstorms or whatever. So there are lots of other things that you can do when you look at new technologies, and so it's been very interesting to see some of the ways that we've been able to use online technology now to move forward on things like voter registration and stuff like that. So, but it's interesting because our very first electronic poll book task force, we heard presentation from a county in Iowa that developed a system that has been adopted in most of the counties in Iowa. Very sophisticated system built at the county level that they just make available more or less kind of like open source, and extremely well done. And it was very encouraging to see relatively low cost local initiative that gave them a whole lot of information and that kind of thing. So we'll now hear from the vendors. There's lots of companies, not lots, but maybe half dozen companies who have developed a product, and you can buy that product, you can lease that product. One of them based here, so that's all good. And we'll spend quite a bit of time kind of hearing pitches, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And the kind of end result is that we'll have some new information about the new technology that's coming on board. And people will, I'm guessing, still want to make sure that their township has the power to decide if they're going to move in this direction or not. And our townships are the kind of backbone, in a way, of our system. It was not a big surprise that the proposed overturning of our election system and that constitutional amendment proposal was to get rid of same-day registration, basically eliminate the way that we do absentee voting, and it required some people to provide a certain kind of identification. But it was in the rural areas where it was defeated, not in the urban areas. And but it's because people have a much clearer view of what is our election system, and they have a much clearer view about how long we've had and how we've built that system up. And of course, in Minnesota, people are quite active. You have nearly, sometimes 78% of people voting. And most of us, 61% of us, have used Election Day registration. So when somebody proposes we eliminate Election Day registration, you kind of rub people the wrong way.
Yeah.
And Minnesotans don't like being railroaded. They don't like being lied to. They don't like being bamboozled or somebody, messing with their systems. We're proud of our state. We're proud of public service. We're proud of how we've, made a life out here on the prairie. And you can see it. You can see it in that state capitol. Those Civil War veterans built us that state capitol, and they wanted it to say out loud how proud they were of the state, and they wanted the inside to remind us about the sacrifice that people have made on our behalf as future generations. I think that value runs through our state. I think people think about that whether you're talking about the election, the state capitol, or our education system or whatever. People are proud of the past. They want to be good stewards of those gifts that have come to us, but they also are thinking, how should I be investing for future generations, just like those who've come before have invested for us. And the Minnesotans consistently have lifted up those values of remembering our history, being a good steward of those gifts, but investing in the future. And I think they think about that when they approach elections or when they approach just their choices in life.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I've been speaking with Minnesota Secretary of State Mark Ritchie. That's all we've got time for. I hope to see you again next week on the St. Paul Forum.